Welcome, everyone, to Indications and Warnings with Chuck Pfarrer, co-produced by Alan Brewer. Chuck and I are recording this broadcast on November 2nd, 2025. It is day 1,348 of Russia's full-scale genocidal invasion of Ukraine. We're going to devote almost the entirety of this show to what is really happening in Pokrovsk. And we're going to put this battle in the context of the time frame of almost 4 years of war now, and also in the context of the zero line between Pokrovsk and Kostyantynivka. Chuck, what really is happening in Pokrovsk? There is conflicting news, reports of a daring insertion with Black Hawk helicopters. What's the situation right now on the streets of Pokrovsk?
Well, it is highly dynamic, and I won't say that it is favorable to Ukraine. Again, conflicting sources, which are something that Alan and I have to pick through all the time. It seems to be a concurrent theme that approximately 60% of the town of Pokrovsk is in play. That doesn't mean the Russians control it, but it means within 60% of the urban area, there are ongoing fights. So these can be characterized as small unit on small unit. We know the Russians infiltrated in teams of 5 to 10 people. 24 hours ago, our information was that Russians were being told to avoid contact until more Russian troops, a threshold, had entered the city. It seems that about 12 hours ago, those Russian units were given the green light to engage. If we're looking at the 2 November 1715 Pokrovsk city axis, you can see a large number of contacts to the west of the city, to the east of the city, and to the south of the city. Also, Russian forces attacking from the east toward Minorad and Mirolubivka. Those battle lines are much harder to plot. However, the contact icons on this map, they are all geolocated. So again, you can see, there is essentially light infantry fights scattered throughout this map. But we also have information, Alan, on larger Russian attacks that did come to grief.
Well, we know that many of the Russian infiltrators actually dressed in civilian clothes, either in order to enter Pokrovsk or in order to disguise their presence. I found that an interesting tidbit of information.
Yeah, and you get into the rules of war, etc. I mean, it's a trick that is used more often than not, and you can play very close to the rules. For example, even in my day, we'd have a patch of Velcro on our shoulder. This was the days before people got 500 patches to put on their uniform. But before we made contact, we put an American flag on our shoulder, and that was completely legitimate. However, in the context of this war against this adversary, the first thing those civilian-clad Russian infiltrators did were massacre people at a train stop. So these aren't the guys that are going to rescue your hijacked airliners. These are typical Russians with the typical Russian rules of engagement, which are none, and do whatever you want.
And putting information together, President Zelensky reported that Ukrainian forces were outnumbered 8-1 around Pokrovsk. The Russians claim to have upwards of 100,000 troops, they have called them, ready to assault and occupy Pokrovsk. To my way of thinking, this doesn't necessarily mean there are 15,000 odd Ukrainian troops in Pokrovsk. We don't actually know the number.
No, we don't. I can tell you that, I'm going to call BS on 130,000 troops, Russian troops working the Pokrovsk battle space. In my estimation, there are probably 30,000 Russian bayonets right now, meaning actual trigger pullers in this area. And that would, there might be 60,000 Russian troops in the Pokrovsk area. But again, you hear the Russians tout these numbers, which are the only impressive thing about Russian forces, numbers. Their combat efficiency is preposterously low. Again, to put this 2-3 year fight and progress to Pokrovsk in perspective, just in the Pokrovsk area of operation, and we'll be going to a larger map, just in the scope of that larger map, the Russians have lost 135,000 casualties just to take Pokrovsk, and that is more by 10 or 15,000 than the entire number of soldiers in the French army, right? So the battle map that the Russians do is the kind that no other army on earth would tolerate. And again, you and I have said for a long time, Russia's never going to run out of human hearts to throw into the battle, but they're running out of army right now.
Well, originally, the city of Pokrovsk was called home by about 60,000 Ukrainians when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. So that's almost 4 years ago. Pokrovsk was about 40 kilometers from the front line, which at that time was just outside Donetsk City. So in one way, Chuck, it has taken Russia almost 4 years now to insert the first troops into the city of Pokrovsk. And they have lost 120,000 troops in the course of doing that, twice the population of a city that is now destroyed.
And this is something we've seen again. I did a recent piece for the Kyiv Post called Pokrovsk and What Comes After. The parallels to Bakhmut are absolutely striking. However, the Russian casualties in the Bakhmut area were almost double what they are in Pokrovsk. So the Russians lost 250,000 of all casualties to take Bakhmut, which again availed them nothing. Bakhmut was not and could not ever be the keystone point of Ukrainian offense in the east. We have the exact same situation here in Pokrovsk. Some people are still calling it the vital logistics hub of Pokrovsk, and as we were just talking about, the status of a military objective is not determined but so much by its cartography or its road junctions. It changes in the context of the immediate battle circumstances around it. Pokrovsk is no longer a logistics hub, it's a terminal point, right? It is the edge of the empire. So Ukraine is going to have to determine how many resources and how many lives and to what purpose they will be applied in the Pokrovsk battle space. And we may be looking at the fall of Pokrovsk. But again, some developments just broke before the show. I'm not on the Ukrainian general staff, so there are surprises afoot.
Well, it's interesting just looking at the map you put up today, Chuck. The Ukrainian attacks to the north of Pokrovsk, to the north of Moskovska. You might say that these are leftover attacks from Ukraine's success in cutting off that salient aimed at Dobropilya. In fact, once Ukraine had cleaned that salient out, there were Ukrainian soldiers free to move toward Pokrovsk in relief. Is that what we're seeing?
Well, Thomas will put up the 2 November map where we can see this sort of red mitten once again. We've used this metaphor on several battles so far. You've got the thumb coming up from the south and the fingers to the north. You can see that the Ukrainian, and these are armored attacks, so these are combined arms, maneuver warfare, offensive operations staged by Ukraine against the Russian forces to the east of the Thiel 515 highway. So what the Ukrainians are doing, they're attacking the fingers of the mitt, and the thumb of the mitt is pointing towards Pokrovsk. This may seem a little counterintuitive, right? Why wouldn't you rush everybody into Pokrovsk? Well, Ukraine has a very thorough understanding of what makes the Russian army tick. This is going to sound preposterous, but it is true. The person who has been commanded to take the city of Pokrovsk, the thumb, is not going to do anything to help the fingers. Unlike in a NATO army where we would transfer forces, etc., he doesn't care what happens up to the north of him. So Ukraine is taking advantage of that fission within the Russian command structure. So that by hitting those fingers, some resources are going to have to be diverted. But I think we'll see that, imagine these competing generals butting heads about this. That will lead to more dysfunction. And the other thing we know, and Ukraine knows, and our audience knows, nothing is more difficult to achieve than breaking contact and retreating in an orderly fashion on the battlefield. And there is not a single trained soldier fighting for Russia in this area. So we'll see how this develops. This is something, the information just came out about a half an hour ago while you and I were talking.
Russia has already claimed that Pokrovsk is surrounded and all but occupied. Russian trolls have been out in force. None of these Russian reports are true. As we said last week, you cannot give any Russian report any credence whatsoever. It is simply part of the Russian disinformation war, which, by the way, Ukraine is once again winning, whether you look at Chuck's maps to see that evidence or whether you look to Washington, D.C. I think probably everyone was astonished to hear about this Black Hawk raid, the insertion of elite Ukrainian forces somewhere in Pokrovsk with a couple of Black Hawk helicopters. A raid supposedly directed by our favorite general himself.
Right. We've got a little bit more information and videos of the actual insertion. Believe me, it was something like right out of, if I could be humble, my own career. You have Black Hawks coming in at literally treetop level, flying through considerable amounts of smoke, which they did deliberately. They would even divert to go into the smoke. We don't know how successful this particular operation was. They inserted under fire both the insertion platforms. Both Black Hawks got away. The insertion was conducted in a very professional manner, meaning the bird touches down, everybody splits almost in different directions. Again, when you have trained troops, you can do this. Do not want to bunch up on insert, especially when there are drones about. But Ukraine picked the target. They picked the Russian units against which they thought this would work. Guys kind of a little asleep at the switch. Apparently, there was an industrial building in the southern limits of Pokrovsk itself, and for some reason that was the target. We don't know why. We do know that the target was soon after attacked by Russian fiber optic drones. Then our information sort of goes blank for a little bit. But there have been contacts reported south of the zero line, south of Pokrovsk. I have a hunch that these are some of the forces that were inserted operating in the Russian rear. So I wish we had more information. That's all I know right now. But you know what? You gear up for an operation, you get on a helicopter, and you're flying into the combat zone. over the combat zone and inserting your heart is in your mouth and also in the mouths of the pilots, because pilots don't just get to land and drop you off. They have to do false insertion, right? They can't just go hover and land over one place and leave, because you might as well shoot rockets up into the air. So this was an incredible operation, and I'm not surprised General Budanov was in the area.
Yeah, as I say, our favorite general, Kirill Budanov, who was also present in Vovchansk to stabilize the situation there. I know there's a little bit of self-promotion apparent here for Budanov to be seen on his way somewhere near Pokrovsk. I think the photographs and video of Budanov were actually at a gas station in Pavlorod on the way to Pokrovsk. It's where, Chuck, if you and I had turned right, we would have gone to Pokrovsk.
Yes, absolutely. And I can tell you, folks, there's a lot of weird stuff that happens at Ukrainian gas stations, but you don't have to wait in a line for gas or
right.
Food. Yeah.
So if we roll back in time just a little bit here, Chuck, so we're looking at the 2 November map right now with these counter attacks to the north of Pokrovsk. A couple of days ago, in a slightly wider angle map, and this, this is also a 2 November map, Chuck, but from earlier today, you can see a better picture, I guess, of all the contact points, especially along the southern line of contact. This is serious business for the Ukrainian soldiers in these contacts, and you got to say, somewhat unexpected that such a Ukrainian force would be available to strike there.
Yeah, there's a good way for everyone to think about, people often ask the question, well, why doesn't Ukraine launch this big offensive? Or why didn't Ukraine respond quicker to threats to Pokrovsk, et cetera? Ukraine has very finite resources. They are operating with interior lines of communication, which is an advantage. But imagine they're in an egg, right? And in order to get into the egg, the bad guys have to move around the diameter. Around the circumference, and Ukraine has to move along the radius. Okay, all that's great. But what Ukraine has to worry about is a large-scale Russian offensive occurring in a direction that they have not anticipated. And that is why there are tactical reserves, local reserves, and strategic reserves. And Ukraine plays them very, very carefully. So, again, one of the best things they could have done, and they are doing it, is to attack separate the thumb from the fingers. And I promise you, the Russians are not going to be in a hurry to divert any resources away from Pokrovsk. Maybe they will be forced to by Gerasimov or someone else, but even if they pull the logistics back from Pokrovsk, which they may be compelled to do, that means they're light infantry in there. Remember, they're using up 1,000 rounds a day. Pretty soon they're going to run out of stuff. But also those two commanders on the fingers and the thumb, they are not playing together. Russian generals don't play nice. There isn't a bigger picture. So we'll have to see. Let's see what this counterattack to the north does.
And when you look at the 1715 UTC November 2nd map, you can see there are really three urban arenas where there's going to be street-to-street fighting in Pokrovsk, in Minorod, and in Moskovsky. So it's a very complex urban battlefield.
Yeah, one of the things I think that a prudent commander would consider at this point is to evacuate soldiers who are south of Moskovsky. There isn't any reason to keep them there. When you see that pale gray-green color on one of the maps Alan and I make, that is the death zone. There is not a tree line. There is not anything going on there, and there's no place to hide. So, holding that is counterproductive.
Chuck is the cartographer. I'm not. I can read these maps and I love looking at Chuck's maps, but Chuck is the cartographer, not me. Russia has employed cab bombs. I'd say certainly dozens of times now in its approach and assault of Pokrovsk. Ukraine has answered with French hammer bombs and to great effect, actually identifying some concentrations of Russian forces in specific buildings in Pokrovsk.
Yeah, Ukraine has excelled in tactical intelligence on the battlefield, determining the location of adjacent Russian units, determining enemy order of battle, how many people are there, who commands them, etc. They're also very good at DFing, using direction finding to find these Russian units. And we know, again, you get a guy who's got 5 days of training, you hand him a walkie-talkie, he's going to burn the battery out talking to people. And every time he hits the transmission switch for 2 microseconds, he's been detected and he's been locked on. Now, as the weather gets worse, and I expect this fight to go on, look, will it go till Christmas? I'm not willing to even say that anymore. Maybe it won't hold till Thanksgiving. Maybe it's going to go as long as it goes in Bakhmut. But I can tell you this, every night that it gets below freezing, those Russians are going to be concentrated in structures, which, as Alan and I saw, that there is like this standard Soviet issue apartment building. They're all over Ukraine. They're virtually identical. A stairway that goes up 6 stories and apartments on either side. Look, those hammer bombs, they're going to be falling. And if you get a 2,000-pound bomb in your building with you, it's going to be a very amusing night. And we're seeing that happening even now.
Yeah. Those buildings cannot withstand one of those hammer bombs. It pretty much obliterates them, exactly as a Russian cab bomb obliterates these very same design buildings. Fighting as long as it takes in this war of attrition is something Ukraine did in Bakhmut. It's something Ukraine did in Velika Novosilka, for that matter. And it's something that Ukraine is doing here. There is no way of knowing how much more time Ukraine can inflict these casualties at a rate of 5 to 1. And I'm quite certain that rate of 1 Ukrainian casualty for 5 Russian casualties is actually higher in Pokrovsk. Ukraine is going to inflict these casualties for as long as possible.
Yeah, and again, we've talked about this before as well. Urban fighting is a lot like jungle fighting, in that whoever gets there first and waits is going to have an advantage. And it's the Russians that are compelled to take offensive action. So Ukrainian fighters in Pokrovsk can be on the defensive. Now, they are seeking contact right now, south of the M30. They're trying to mop up these Russian isolated Russian units. But it's going to cost Russia a lot to take this city. They're not constrained by their losses, but the Ukrainians are. But right now, the fight in Pokrovsk and all of the AO, this is definitely in the column of an attritional battle, right? As far as Ukraine is concerned, the only thing that they can hope to gain from this is to kill a lot of Russians. Ukraine's going to determine when that strategy, that game, that outcome is worth it for them. Is it worth losing, 10,000 Ukrainians to kill 50,000 Russians? Maybe that will be determined. But we'll see. Again, the parallels to Bakhmut are interesting. In the case of Bakhmut, you had Chasiv Yar, which was a very obvious terrain feature there that was going to negate further Russian advances, no matter what they did in Bakhmut or how many people they had to kill to take it. In Pokrovsk, we don't have a prominent terrain feature there, but what lies beyond Pokrovsk for 20, 30, 40, 50 miles is flat, open country, which is just as lethal. Just as lethal. And again, this is going to be one of those fights, as we saw in Bakhmut, where the Russian local forces will be culminated when they take Pokrovsk. They will have shot their bolt. They're going to be chewed up. So again, I expect this to fold. Alan, just look, you and I did the color commentary and the play-by-play for Bakhmut, and I think this is going to be pretty much the same thing.
Yeah. One thing in an urban battle zone like this, the Ukrainian objective is to identify the Russian troops' location, isolate them, and extinguish them. And as long as those Russian troops are dispersed, that becomes a pretty tedious effort for Ukraine to undertake. You kind of hope that fear grips these Russians that have infiltrated Pokrovsk, and they assemble together, feeling that they are safer in a larger group. But that's not true.
Yeah, it's not. And the more they pull together, meaning in numbers, the more lucrative a target they become. But here's another sort of irony about this. I promise you that right now, 40% of the Russian troops in Pokrovsk have been in the army less than a month, right? So they don't have the sort of soldiering skills. But here's what will happen to a group of 5 guys you throw into this life and death cauldron. They will pull together, right? They will get the same bonding experience that every other soldier in the world gets by the adversarial relations in boot camp. I mean, there is a reason the drill instructor screams in your face. There's a reason why he turns your room all and throws it. All of that confrontational stuff is to get those 100 civilians to do something they've never done in their life, pull together against an existential threat. The drills are. So what's happening in Pokrovsk? They're thrown into this crucible. They will start pulling together. Now, they may not be very good soldiers, but these are the Russian troops. They're going to start fighting for each other. All of that's not really good for Ukraine, but if they run out of bullets first, and then they run out of water, and they are out of shelter, you can see they're a perishable commodity. So again, it's the situation looks the way it does. Everyone can draw their own conclusions, but even now, it's Ukraine that is determining the place and pace of this battle, right? Is Pokrovsk a foregone conclusion? Look, maybe it is at this point, but game's still on.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important point to emphasize, that it is Ukraine directing the pace of the battle in the places where they want the battle to occur. And if we look at that 1715 map from today, Chuck, and look at that string of Ukrainian contacts on the southern edge of Pokrovsk, between Pokrovsk and the little neighborhood of Pershay-Trevina, could one of the objectives here be interrupting Russian logistics so that any Russian troops that have gotten deeper into Pokrovsk are going to run out of ammunition, water, and food faster?
Absolutely. That would be a primary objective. It's hard to really know what that helicopter insertions were all about. Put about 20 operators in, which is about one SEAL platoon. I'm kind of racking my brain what I would have been put in for, right? There's like X number of things that 20 SEAL type operators can do. We can seize things, but we're not the guys to hold things. And a raid, of course, is get in and get out. Now, there's a lot of things they could do. They could insert sensors. They could have carried in 100 drones to lay out all over roads. I mean, there's lots of things to do. But one of the priorities for the Ukrainian commanders in this battle space is, fix, find, terminate, and frustrate the Russian effort. So how do you do that? Well, you unplug their logistics, right? And as we've often said, a soldier without ammunition isn't a combatant; he's a homeless person. So if they can do that will be important. Look, the situation does not look good right now. I'll say that it doesn't look good, but we're in the second quarter of the football game, so let's see what happens.
Before the Russians overran Vuhledar, they launched a tremendous artillery barrage, which was really the signal that of what Russia's intentions were in terms of Vuhledar. Russia has pulled up artillery to the east outside Myrna-Rod. They're using it, I guess, pretty effectively, especially in Myrna-Rod. But I wouldn't anticipate the same kind of artillery barrage that we saw in Vuhledar, for the one reason that there were no Russian troops in Vuhledar. There are only Ukrainians in Vuhledar when that barrage went off.
Yeah, and during the battles of Vuhledar, this war has changed so much in the last 2 years. I mean, the primary threat to Russian artillery back in the Vuhledar days was counter artillery fire, right? Counter battery fire. The good old days. You locate the enemy gun and you call in a fire mission on them. Now, local drones can swarm an artillery piece. You have counter battery radar. It detects the incoming shells, and what that does is the bad guy shell leaves the tube, and while it's in the air, the radar knows what kind it is, what caliber it was, and exactly where it's fired from, and coincidentally, exactly where it's going to hit. But now that information flashes over the battle space, and Ukrainian drones and individual rifle squads are freed to attack that position. It was Soviet doctrine and Russian doctrine to precede every major attack with incredible volumes of artillery. So I expect this is going to continue to play in as much as possible as these commanders and these troops can execute Russian doctrine. But we've seen they don't always do it. And this fight in Pokrovsk, it's not about Russian tanks prowling the streets. That doesn't work. This is a light infantry fight on light infantry fight. And again, Ukraine has the advantage, the training of their soldiers and the fact that they are defending in an urban battle space rather than on offense.
Is there any tactic that might tip Russia's hand? Anything that you would look for them to do to indicate what their thinking is and what their immediate plans are?
Well, there's one thing I think we can assume. Look, Putin needs a city. He hasn't taken any location of any consequence in the last 18 months. I would expect that the great majority of his resources are going to be devoted to getting Russian soldiers at whatever cost and however quickly they are killed onto the streets of Pokrovsk. I think it's a great idea that they've hit the fingers because we're going to see and think of the things that have happened. Look, Bakhmut destroyed Prigozhin mentally in his head. He saw the unbelievable sacrifice. He poured tens of thousands of convicts and Wagnerites into the fight, but he came away unhinged by the fact that Russian commanders all played against him. Now, I'm telling you, the north of this operation is going to play against the south. And the South is going to get on the red phone to Moscow and say, I'm the most important vector in this attack. I'm not giving my stuff up to anyone. And in the meantime, anytime you can get the enemy playing against itself and you have a wily commander like Budanov, we'll see what's going on. We'll see what happens.
So just to put Pokrovsk again into some context here, Pokrovsk, the vital logistic hub on the Zero Line, that would mean the M32 highway that goes out of Pokrovsk and makes its way up to Kostyantynivka. But the M32 has been contested and in some places under Russian fire control for weeks now. That has certainly changed that aspect of Pokrovsk. I don't think Pokrovsk has been a logistical hub for 2 months, 3 months.
Yeah, at least. And we talked about this last time. When the Battle of Avdiivka was on, Pokrovsk was it. It was a transportation nexus. It was a logistical base. It was a base for military operations, and it's not now. Again, much like the Battle of Bakhmut, I'm continuously amazed, and anyone with a military education will continue to be amazed by the Russians. Am I willing to expend? They're going to expend at least 200,000 dead in taking Pokrovsk. And when you pull back on the much bigger map, the M32, as you just said, is not an avenue of advance. And the M30, the nearest city, is 40 miles away down that interstate with flat, open country like Iowa all around it. You and I commented when we went through, looks like great tank country. Yeah. And we both said, if you dominate the air, yeah. If you don't, anything from strike fighters to drones to attack helicopters, the Russians aren't going to be able. Look, first of all, Pokrovsk is not the key to the Eastern defense. It's just this beat up old town that used to have 60,000 people in it. They aren't going to be able to go farther from. And I always wonder, why do they pick these dead end objectives? No answer. That's a strategic failure. You hire knuckle draggers like me to be tacticians. Somebody who went to Georgetown is supposed to tell me what the best city to take is, and this doesn't meet any of those criteria.
No. In terms of lessons learned, I think that Ukraine has learned an important lesson in preparing additional defense lines in the rear of Pokrovsk. And this is actually their failure outside Avdiivka. They had failed to prepare defensive lines between Avdiivka and Pokrovsk, and that's why the Russians were able to advance relatively quickly to the outskirts of Pokrovsk. Not the case this time. Ukraine is already building and has built pretty substantial defensive lines to the north and northwest of Pokrovsk. That open territory, Chuck.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's this part of Ukraine is incredibly beautiful. It's beguiling. Yeah. But there aren't a lot of trees. There isn't a lot of cover, and there'll be even less cover in the winter, which is now, and it's denuded of its leaves. And I cannot help but think, look, that months ago, a year ago, Ukrainian planners had to look, what has been the conduct of the war? What is it that Russia wants to do? What does Russia prioritize above all other efforts? And it is taking cities. Now, in the process of doing that, they are utterly destroyed. And no one who can even move their wheels on their wheelchair is going to hang around and let the Russians sweep over them. And Ukrainian planners, when Avdiivka started to fall, I am certain they realized, look, Pokrovsk is next. That this is what Russia is going to do. But again, looking at the map, the next city is more than 40, 50 miles away. So we'll have to see. Pokrovsk will probably be the last thing the Russians can do before winter. We'll have to see. Whether or not they take it, that's up to the Ukrainian General Staff.
Yeah. And it probably will be the last thing Russia can do before winter. Remember, when you speak of culmination, and the Russian forces after the Battle of Bakhmut were culminated, weeks went by before there was any Russian advance in the direction of Chasiv Yar. It's because they were too exhausted. Now, after Pokrovsk, I think you'll see the same interruption of Russian offensive operations, and it will be complicated by the arrival of winter.
Yeah, and everyone, again, some of these really important little factoids are not reported in Western media. Russia is not meeting their monthly recruitment quotas anymore. Mm-hmm. Nobody wants to be a ruble millionaire anymore. Everyone realizes that if you go into the Russian army, it is a death sentence, right? You're going to die. So Russia's burn rate continues to be 30,000 troops a month. They lose 2 battalions every day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. No military force in history has ever achieved its overarching military goals losing 2 battalions every single day. And remember, these are not 2 battalions lost landing in Normandy, right? Or even fighting in Pokrovsk. This is the daily burn rate for the Russians. Why do they lose that many? Because they keep launching these uncoordinated, undermanned, undertrained attacks. The only thing they can do is infiltrate. And now, by infiltrating light infantry, a guy with a rifle, 2 magazines, and a ham sandwich is all they're getting in there. And how long that guy fights depends on not his ham sandwich, but how much ammunition you can get to him. That's it. That's the deciding factor.
And it depends on his morale as well. I mean, we saw a lot of Russian soldiers around Dobroglia surrender. I mean, not only because they were surrounded, but because they were beaten down.
And look, these guys are. They are going to be beaten down. And let's assume for a second, and this is by no means a prediction, that Pokrovsk falls here in the next couple of weeks. Russia's going to pour guys into that city where they are going to clump up in buildings where they're going to get picked off 4, 5, 6 airstrikes a day, and their hammer bombs are going to drop the buildings around these guys. That's going to happen. Now, whether that happens in the entire city of Pokrovsk or just south of the M30 and south of the railroad right away, we'll see. But that's definitely going to happen.
And by the way, Russian casualties were more than 1,000 a day through the month of October. Russia suffered more than 31,000 casualties in the month of October. If you want to keep track of that daily number, follow Ragnar Gudmundsson on Twitter and take a look at his casualty dashboard every single day. It's a good way to keep track of that. You know, the fact that Pokrovsk is virtually destroyed, just as Vuhledar was virtually destroyed, just as Bakhmut was destroyed, in a way, this allows people to understand a good part of the Russian strategy here, and that is to create a Ukraine that is unlivable for Ukrainians. Ukrainians are not coming back to Pokrovsk. Ukrainians are not coming back to Chasiv Yar, a tiny town by comparison, because the Russians have completely destroyed these cities and towns and destroyed the infrastructure that enables a town to live, the heat, the gas, the electricity, the water. It's all been destroyed.
Well, and we saw that during our our recent trip. Uh, Russia destroys everything it can touch. And when we were on the frontline cities, and even in places like Odessa and even Lviv, in every place we visited, one of the Russians' primary targets seems to have been the market, right? They hit the market. They hit them in Odessa. We saw them where we were and everywhere we were. But the closer you got to the zero line, the more desolate things became. It's biblical, the isolation of desolation. That is the Ruski Mir. That is it. And what was so amazing to me, we were driving in the car one day and I just turned around the back seat and I go, Alan, now I know what they want. They want this. They want this beautiful country. And everywhere they have touched, they have turned it from beauty into a shit sandwich.
Yeah.
That's it. That's what they're doing.
Yeah. Now, Russia has not stopped its almost nightly aerial assault on Ukrainian cities with ballistic missiles and with drones. In fact, Russia has succeeded in blacking out Kyiv for a number of hours, blacking out Chernihiv, Sumy, causing some blackouts in Kharkiv. But Ukraine is quite skilled in putting the electric grid back together, getting generators operating, and getting electricity back on. Yes, there are rolling blackouts. There's no question about that. What's interesting and what has changed in the course of this war this fall and coming winter is that Ukraine is now doing exactly the same thing in Russia, blacking out Belgorod, blacking out Bryansk, and blacking out a large suburb of Moscow.
Yeah, it's Ukraine is giving as well as it gets, but again, the number one Russian target besides markets are high density urban housing, right? They hit apartment buildings. No matter what any Botnik or even some of the I'm not really biased. Look, we saw it, folks. We did 2,600 kilometers. We saw it with our own eyes, including one horrific apartment building in Kharkiv where Alan and I reported from the wreckage 6 Shahed drones striking one apartment building. One. It was a concealed military thing. We went through the wreckage, folks. We found a lot of children's toys. We didn't find anything else.
No.
So, well, it's what Russia wants, and let's see about Pokrovsk. Again, I want this to sink in. Russia has already lost more soldiers in the fight for Pokrovsk than are in the entire French army. Cooks, bottle washers, technicians, radio guys, grunts, armor, artillery, every swinging individual in the French army, they've lost that in Pokrovsk. That doesn't mean they're going to win. It doesn't mean they're this invincible machine. It means they are churning their army apart. They're destroying it. And there has to be a bond between commanders and the men. And all these men know is these guys send us to die pointlessly. We'll see how there's one more stressor coming up for the Russian army. General Winter is waiting in the wings. And that it's always going to affect the army that is the most poorly supplied, the most poorly led, and the army with the lowest morale.
Yeah.
It bites the hardest on those guys.
With the lowest morale in for many reasons, because the least well supplied. And we talked about that on previous shows. No pure drinking water, for example. I mean, that's going to wreak havoc in the Russian ranks this winter. As we draw to a close here tonight, Chuck, let's talk about two racing clocks. There's this one clock I'll call the attritional clock. That's on the zero line in Ukraine. But then there is the economic collapse clock that is racing inside Russia. And that is a clock that Ukraine is making run faster and faster every time it strikes a refinery. Just last night or the night before, striking the oil port in Tuapse. Oil slicks reported in the harbor. So there's no question that Ukrainian missiles found their target.
No doubt about it. And again, another interesting occurrence. Ukraine, that doesn't have a navy, has been able to interdict Russian fuel terminals at the extreme eastern end of the Black Sea. There's a crude carrier on fire, two of them, one possibly sunk at pier side. Look, this was an exquisite attack. And it's constantly balanced in my mind to Russia sending $1.5 million cruise missile into an apartment building while Ukraine will pick bona fide strategic targets, industrial bottlenecks. The only Russian plant that makes a light emitting diode for a certain thing, they hit that. The oil infrastructure, which they are interdicting. What is it now? 25% of the Russian capacity is no more. A great article just out today from our friend Will Thiel. Follow him, folks. Petroleum engineer who worked in Russia, an American who's now an Aussie, but a great guy. You want to know what's going on and the nuts and bolts of how Ukraine is taking apart these POL facilities. Will is your guy.
Yeah. And you can find a link on Twitter for Will Thiel, and we'll post that link in the notes to this show as well. But yeah, if you want to get your hands around the real economic picture in Russia, especially in the energy sector, you've got to read Will Thiel's analysis. It's no longer Ukrainian pinprick attacks on the Russian energy infrastructure. It's concentrated, it's nightly, it's achieving its objective.
Yeah, and again, Ukraine has no strategic aviation capability, right? They don't have B-1B Lancers. They don't have B-52 missile trucks. They don't really have deep penetration strike fighters. They're doing this with indigenously produced long-range precision strike munitions. It's amazing. This is the David and Goliath fight, and David is constantly whipping out new stuff. I will also say this. I think it's about time for another Ukrainian special operations coup. And just like Operation Spiderweb, look, it won't be anything like Operation Spiderweb, but it will have the same astounding, wide-reaching effects as Spiderweb. I'm not willing to say what I think or what might happen, but give it 4 weeks and we're going to see something, Alan, because it's just time. It's just time.
Right. I guarantee you we'll see such surprises, and we'll see surprises right here in Pokrovsk. I mean, that Black Hawk helicopter insertion carried with it the element of surprise. I don't think the Russians ever expected the Ukrainians would attempt anything like that. And yet 2 Black Hawk helicopters at the treetops accomplished something.
Absolutely. And I just, it was flashback city. I looked at these Black Hawks treetop level, keeping into the smoke, and it was, hey, there you go.
Yeah.
The Ukrainians really know what they're doing. Their special operations forces are in the 10 ring.
No proof whatsoever that those Black Hawk helicopters were destroyed on their way out. No proof whatsoever that the 20 plus elite Ukrainian soldiers were killed and captured. We'll wait for the full report about that raid.
Yeah, absolutely. See, there's the other thing. You information warfare. You want to get there first with the most outrageous statement, because then people are going to have to try to refute the first report, right? We know categorically the insertion was carried out. Ergo, look, these guys got out too. They picked a soft, sleepy target, right? This wasn't where Eagles dare. When I throw a dart at a map, I don't want to come up against 101st Airborne. I want to come up against the 297th Flashlight Repair Battalion, right? I want sleepy people, and I want a dark and stormy night. But this took place in daylight. The flying was first rate. Their actions at insertion were perfect. Again, no evidence of them being wiped out and the helicopters being shot down. As we used to say, tell it to the Marines, right? We'll see how that's going.
Well, I hope, Chuck, that this brief update here on indications and warnings has really helped people understand better what is happening in Pokrovsk. Yes, there is a deadly battle that's unfolding every single day, street by street, building by building, in Pokrovsk, in Myrnarod, in Moskovsky. There are surprises yet to come. Ukraine is counterattacking. And while there are Russian soldiers infiltrating the city of Pokrovsk in greater and greater numbers, it is news you have to watch every single day in order to come up with some idea of what's happening in Pokrovsk. So maybe Putin will get his deadline occupation, which is November 20th. That's in 18 days. Or maybe he won't. Maybe this attrition of the Russian military will go on for a bit longer. It's really up to Ukraine.
Yeah, absolutely. What we can, and look, Alan and I, it'll be a couple days, we'll give you another update. You can expect maximal Russian effort through the end of this month. So fights on in Pokrovsk. We're going to bring you all the news, the good news and the bad news. But keep watching. Like I said, we're in the early second quarter of this fight. So let's all keep looking at it, and we're going to give you what's happening, folks. Thank you for spending your time with us.
And leave your comments in the comment section underneath this broadcast. Recommend indications and warnings to friends and colleagues if you find it valuable. And pay no attention to the Russian trolls, who I noticed have come out in droves here on indications and warnings. Chuck, let the dogs bark.
Let the dogs bark. And I came up with my own anti-troll little video, and perhaps Thomas will share it as we go out under the credits. If you do want to engage the Russian trolls, actually the best thing to do is block them. But I always enjoy telling them that in the troll farm, your numbers are down, and one of these days, I'll see you in Pokrovsk.
Chuck, thanks very much for your time tonight and those analytical maps that you produce every single day. I don't know how you do it. With that, we will keep watching Pokrovsk. And tonight, as I get closer and closer to Ukraine, as a matter of fact, that's one of my destinations. I'm proud to say, Slava Ukraini.
Heroim Slava. Good night, everybody. Thanks again.